Hi, I'm Johanna Weaver, and you're listening to Tech Mirror. My guest today is Professor Lee Bygrave. He has a really interesting story about his name, which he's going to tell us in a minute. He's the director of the Norwegian Research Centre for Computers and Law at the University of Oslo's Department of Private Law. He's also an affiliate at the University of Oxford Centre for Health Law and Emerging Technologies. So, Lee, let's start with what you were just telling me about your name. How do we pronounce it in the Norwegian context?
Well, the Norwegians would sometimes say Bygrave, which actually...
Bygrave, I love it. It sounds so good.
Yeah. It actually means city grave or city diggings. So it's not a particularly uplifting surname to have. But I keep trying to insist on the English pronunciation, which is Bygrave.
Bygrave, there we go.
As in Max, but no S.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today on Tech Mirror. It's a real pleasure to have you here. You're here visiting at the ANU College of Law, and we wanted to take this opportunity because you've been doing some really fascinating work around the concepts of security by design and how we're starting to see this emergence of design language in legal and regulatory frameworks. We're going to dive into that in a minute, but before we do, we try and ease our podcast guests in with a question about your first interactions with computers or with technology and where your interest in, how did you end up being someone who was focused on working on these types of issues?
Well, we have to go back to the 1980s, back in the day, and I remember the first computer that I had direct experience with.
Yeah.
And it was an Apple Macintosh.
Yeah.
I was a resident at Burton Garron Hall over here on the ANU campus.
Oh, I didn't realise you were an alum. There you go.
Yeah. And an American student had just come back from California with this Apple Macintosh in his luggage.
Wow.
And we locals sort of gathered around this amazing machine and thought, wow. Yeah, exactly. Wow. And
was it one of those sort of square ones or was it the colour one?
No, it was the square one.
Yeah, and or rectangular almost they
were,
weren't
it
they?
Sort of earned the name Fat Mac. and despite its shape, it was decidedly very, very cool.
So you have a legal background. Where did your interest take you in the direction of emerging technologies or law and technologies, computer and technologies?
Well, again, I'd go back to the ANU in my final year of studies, doing a Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Laws degree. I was looking around for a topic for an honours thesis in law, and Peter Bain, who was a professor at the law school at the time, said, this was 1987, by the way. He said, we've got this fresh piece of legislation called the Privacy Act.
Timely.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe you want to write about that.
Yep.
And I had absolutely no idea what the Privacy Act was about. But I started then delving into the literature, discovered there was a lot of literature, mainly philosophical, around privacy, the value of privacy, what threatens privacy, and then wrote an honours thesis. And in doing the research for the honours thesis, I spent a lot of time at the National Library here in Canberra. And I came across a book called A Decade of Computers and Law. And this was an anthology that basically celebrated the first 10 years of research done at the Norwegian Research Centre for Computers and Law in Oslo.
Okay.
So I knew about that centre, and when I read the book at the time, I thought, wow, this is really advanced, but really, really interesting. Little did I know that I'd end up at that centre and now directing the centre.
Yeah.
But so I guess it was a mix of suggestion on the part of Peter Bain and serendipity on the part of that sort of book discovery at the National Library.
That's even more interesting in the context of the direction that I'd like to take the discussion that we have today, looking at security by design, but also comparing it to some of the discussion and evolution of privacy by design. And of course, in Australia, in the context of the Optus, Medibank hacks that are going on, lots of discussion going on about reform of the Privacy Act, which has had a few amendments since you were studying it in 1987, but not a lot since then. So we'll touch on all of those things. But I think as a starting point, let's define what we mean when we're talking about security by design, and then we'll have a conversation about how the evolution of that term has come out, because it's something we hear all the time in conversations at the moment.
Sure. Well, security by design is just one of many by design mantras that are becoming very popular. You see them increasingly flagged in legislation.
Yeah.
A lot of this is happening in Europe with EU legislative acts. And I guess the by design mantra in itself, it's sort of signaling that we need to take the values or interests or the referent object, as it were, that's linked to that particular mantra. We need to take that seriously. And that means that we need to be sort of on the front foot. We need to be planning, designing to ensure that that value or interest is catered for adequately in the environment in which it's supposed to flourish. So it's, I guess I see it as signaling a need to think ahead and to hardwire, as it were, that particular value or interest into the environment. As for security by design, that's originally a software engineering principle that exhorts software engineers to, again, think about security on the front foot, not think of security as an afterthought, as an add-on. You think about it right at the very start of information systems development. You embed it throughout the life cycle of the information systems development process, and you also continually revisit it. In light of changing security threats, for example.
And so you're talking about there being popular mantras, and I think, some of the ones that I'm sure our listeners will have heard of as things like data protection by design, privacy by design, security by design, safety by design, which is something that our eSafety Commissioner in Australia talks about a lot. And one of the things that I was interested in looking at some of your writing was that you have observed that security by design hasn't received as much attention from a legal scholarship perspective as perhaps privacy by design or other terms. So I was a little surprised when I read that, because for me, security by design is something that has been part of the lexicon for so long. But I understand what you're saying is that it's morphed from being an engineering concept into more of a legal and a regulatory concept. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I was also surprised when I started doing research on security by design specifically. And I cast around and I found very, very little, particularly from legal scholars. But also even, scholars looking at regulatory regimes more generally. There was very, very little. And I think it might reflect a perception that security as such is rather mundane, not particularly sexy. Also, even if you look at, say, the security or let's say the engineering community and what it has produced of literature, there are some really substantial texts on security engineering, but there are surveys suggesting that a lot of computer scientists don't find security very pleasurable. It's something they sort of have to do, but it's not something they would, desire to do, and which I also found surprising. And I guess that might also have to do with the fact that it's not until recently that security was a staple part of a basic computer science degree. So you've got a whole generation of software engineers out there for whom security is still a rather alien and somewhat marginal interest. And
so the focus had been on, designing a product that was innovative or new or breaking new ground, rather than on focusing on what the security implications may be. Because, of course, that adds an immense layer of complication to the challenge of designing a new product.
That's right. And I'll return to that shortly, but I think another cause for the lack of focus on security by design has to do with the lack of a high-profile, bespoke legislative provision that's saying, you must adhere to security by design. Now, data protection by design and to some extent privacy by design, they have that provision now in Article 25 of the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. But and I would say that security is implicit in Article 25, but it's not flagged as, it's not flagged explicitly in that provision. So, and then on top of that, you don't have very many high-profile court cases where the judges have wielded the big stick, come down really hard on an organisation for poor security. There are some incidents, but even major scandals like the Equifax hack from 2017, the litigation in the wake of that scandal basically sort of fizzled out, and it's largely forgotten about. And Equifax shares are back at they're back at their what they were prior to that scandal.
Yeah. Which is, and particularly given the litigious nature of the US where the Equifax scandal happened, it is extraordinary that there hasn't been more action in that space. And that's obviously something I think that the new legislation in Australia, we currently have a bill before our parliament that is looking to increase the penalties for breaches. And it's actually an amendment to the Privacy Act, which is being put forward. And it is interesting there, the link between making amendments to the Privacy Act to effectively impose the penalties for poor cybersecurity. And I think that's a really, when I speak to European actors in this space, the link between data protection and cybersecurity is one that is taken as a given. In Australia, we still often speak about them like they're two separate things, which obviously they're two sides of the same coin, but we talk about cybersecurity or security by design, and then we talk about privacy that sits over here. It'll be interesting to see how much that comes together after, in the wake of Optus and Medibank, for example.
But in terms of Europe, while there is a widely acknowledged link between data protection and privacy protection on the one side and security on the other, nonetheless, if you look at the EU legislative framework, there is an immense amount of legislation in addition to the GDPR that has security as its primary remit. And, we have a recent proposal around sort of resilience of connected devices and that sort of stuff. And but that comes on top of at least 3 or 4 other pieces of legislation dealing with security in various contexts. So there is a huge legislative framework that exists in addition to the GDPR. And it's somewhat surprising if all of the cybersecurity provisions for Australia are going to be put under the framework of the Privacy Act.
Well, I don't think there's any suggestion that they will. Actually, the majority of Australia's cybersecurity obligations sit under critical infrastructure legislation, and we've had 2 major pieces of legislation that passed at the end of last year or mid last year, and then the end of last year that have come into play. But they're setting cybersecurity obligations for critical infrastructure. And we don't have, for example, a Cybersecurity Act. And I think the example you're referring to about the EU's proposed Cyber Resilience Act, is that correct?
Yep,
the correct title? I think there'll be a lot of interest in Australia about that, watching how that progresses through the EU Parliament. Can you perhaps just give us a high-level overview in terms of what that Act is proposing to do?
Okay, so the origins of the Act formally are ascribed to Ursula von der Leyen's keynote or State of the Union speech last European autumn, where she said we are going to introduce legislation on connected devices, in effect, sort of Internet of Things. And now we have a proposal that was made public just
in September, I think. It's quite new.
A couple of months ago.
Exactly.
And I must admit, I haven't really gotten into the depths of the proposal. But I see it as an attempt to introduce sort of consistent cybersecurity standards and cyber resilience standards to apply to a whole range of devices without linking up to notions of critical infrastructure. So it's operating somewhat independently of the Network and Information Security Directive that we now have in place already from 2016, and which is soon to be replaced by a second, like the NIS2 directive, as it's called. And both of those network and information security initiatives have had some problems because they have been linked up to particular sectors, which are sort of defined rather loosely, and where member states have adopted somewhat inconsistent views as to what deserves protection under those regimes. But the Connected Devices or Cyber Resilience Act will be more sort of horizontal in scope and applying to products that are put on the market. And we're talking about a large market when it comes to the EU.
Yeah.
So it's probably going to have a global significance as well. And then we can talk about another example of the Brussels effect.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's interesting to me about the Cyber Resilience Act is that it does seem to be focusing on the consumer protection elements of good cybersecurity, which is missing in a lot of the debate, because when we're talking about cybersecurity, and it's partly because of the challenge, you've got to focus getting cybersecurity right. It's easy to talk about it, hard to implement. How do we actually move to a stage where we, rather than just having high level statements about it, how do we actually implement security by design? It's always surprised me, for example, that we haven't had more law and potentially legal actions around things like fitness for purpose. If we have products that don't meet cybersecurity standards, but they're advertised in a way that would indicate that they are cyber secure. And what I think the Cyber Resilience Act is saying is, well, we're actually essentially legislating for fitness for purpose, which is a really fascinating progression as we look at the evolution of the standards. All of this leads back to, and part of the reason why I think we have focused so much on critical infrastructure in this space is, how do you actually define meaningfully a standard of cybersecurity by design in a way that doesn't become redundant by the time you've written the legislation? So it really goes to if we're talking about implementing cybersecurity by design, how do we actually do that from a legal perspective rather than from an engineering perspective?
It's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And I guess EU legislation tries to introduce some flexibility in the legislative standards by referring to, for example, what is the state of the art.
Yeah.
And I find the references to state of the art really fascinating, also from a purely legal perspective, because those references are, in the first place, bringing in sort of soft law conceptions as to what ought to be in place in a hard law framework.
Yeah. And
it's also, in a sense, collapsing the distinction we often make in law between, law as it is and law as it ought to be.
Yeah.
Because when you reference the state of the art, you're referencing something that is inherently dynamic, because the state of the art will change with business, industry, engineering conceptions as to what is sort of best practice. And so it's really, really fascinating. And I think it's probably, a good way to go. I can't see of any other formulations that are going to retain the flexibility needed and yet at the same time signal that we need to be looking outside that legislative framework for the appropriate real world standards, as it were. So we've got to be looking at the work done by the ISO, by those sorts of organizations, by industry bodies as to what they see is good, reasonable steps to secure infrastructure.
And it's fascinating because in the context of the penalty bill that is currently before the Australian Parliament, one of the most controversial elements of that is looking at, there's a provision that's saying that you need to have taken reasonable steps to protect the information. And so in this field, what are reasonable steps becomes, when you're talking about other areas of established law, what is reasonable, you can go to case precedent and, you get a very clear idea of, or certainty actually, because that's what businesses are looking for, is business certainty of the standards that they're looking to be held to. And we don't have that in this concept. And certainly looking at some of the submissions that have been made in response to that penalties provisions, there are calls for, if we are going to go down this route, we need to have very clear guidance on what would be reasonable, and also the concept of safe harbours, so that you're not having penalties for companies that may have a breach when they have taken those reasonable steps. So very much whilst also a theoretical discussion, very much a live discussion that's playing out here in Australia as well.
Sure, and even in Europe, you don't have very much judicial case law that sets out what is reasonable from a court's perspective. And we have a case pending before the Court of Justice of the European Union now, which will hopefully shed light on those sort of reasonable security standards. But that's, as I said, pending. So we're waiting with bated breath.
Yes, to see what comes out. Yes. Yeah, and we recently had a case in Australia that went through the courts as well that said there was an obligation on directors to have good cybersecurity practices. So that's probably one example of case law in Australia. I forget the name of the case. We'll put the link up in there. It was
a federal court decision by a single judge.
Yeah.
Yes. But it didn't really enlighten us a great deal.
Not on the terms of what would be reasonable, but I think it was the first example of a case in Australia that said directors' duties. Directors have a duty to be taking into consideration cybersecurity, which you would hope all directors understand that they have that duty. But it's interesting to see it actually spelled out in the case law. So, but as you say, not in a lot of depth.
Yeah, no, hope. I think all of these security scandals, or many of them at least, signal that CEOs, even maybe CSOs, their security hasn't been sufficiently in their field of focus, and these scandals often evidence incredibly lax approaches to security. So it's often a case of not security by design, but security by disaster. Unfortunately.
I like it. And I was fascinated looking at some research out of ANU's Centre for Social Research that was published yesterday that had some really interesting findings, but the one that most jumped out to me was that 92.8% of all Australian adults believe that the government needs to step in to regulate new technologies to protect consumers. And, I think that's obviously being conducted in the aftermath of Optus, Medibank and a bunch of other things that are happening here. But 92.8% of Australians, that's a pretty stark call for action. And then that for me is, how do we do that effectively? We can't just keep, pushing legislation and regulations through for the sake of, having good sound bites and being seen to respond. It's actually, how do we craft this to achieve that regulatory outcome? Do you think there are lessons that we can learn from the GDPR example where we've crafted privacy by design? You talked about the Brussels effect. I think the EU's privacy regulations, GDPR, really has set a global standards. Is there lessons that we can take from that experience?
Yes, there are. And I think if you're looking at, say, Article 25 of the GDPR, which is about data protection by design and by default, and also by implication, security by design and by default, although there is another provision, Article 32, that deals more fairly and squarely with security. We can look at that provision, particularly Article 25, and see it as being, unfortunately, too convoluted.
I looked it up last night and I was like, I can't even... reading the text of the paragraph, it's incomprehensible, and English is my first language. It's really difficult. Yeah.
Yes, well, you're not alone, and there have been, very highly skilled legal scholars with expertise in this field who have also ended up scratching their heads. And
let alone the engineers who have
let
to.
alone the engineers.
Yeah.
So it's pitched in a way that is unnecessarily complex, and thus it falls short of communicating clearly and directly with, amongst others, the engineering community, who are going to try to make sense of it. And that means, somewhat paradoxically, that the complexity of the phrasing of Article 25 ends up creating a type of black box that the engineering community is often accused themselves of creating with, AI-enhanced decision-making processes. So this sort of black box effect of Article 25 then has sort of stunted, diminished the conversation we have to have between regulators and regulatees. So that's an important lesson to learn. That is, if you're going to have a by design mandate, make sure you formulate it simply and clearly, and not using the sort of contorted syntax that Article 25 is currently formulated in. I think another lesson is that we need to have understandable methodologies. And while in Europe, the European Data Protection Board, which is the collection of representatives of the data protection authorities, the equivalents of the Office of Information Commissioner here, while they've issued guidelines on how to sort of, in a sense, rules of the road for Article 25 operationalisation, even those guidelines are still pitched at a too abstract a level. They're not really very practical, concrete rules of the road. And I've spoken to many software engineers who are still scratching their heads. So we need this. I think the second lesson is, okay, you've got the formulation of the legislative provision done clearly, but you also need to have some established, agreed methodologies for how to implement those mandates. And these will come, but the process is slow, and it needs to be, and it's going to be hard work. And the point is, if you're going to knock on the door of the technology community, you've got to knock on it quite hard and consistently, purposefully, yes, by design in a sense, so that they do take note.
Yeah, and I think one of the sorry to keep going back to the penalties provisions, but it's something that I'm focused on a little bit at the moment in other areas. But looking at many of the submissions that the tech industry is making to that legislation, what another thing that stood out to me is all of them start by saying we actually don't object to stronger penalties. And so, I think the knocking on the door, there are people opening the door cautiously, and it's about that effectiveness and delivering the certainty that is required to then deliver the outcome that we're looking for, which is better cybersecurity or security by design, to deliver an outcome for people, which is often lost in the conversation as well, like for consumers or for individuals. So if we do get cybersecurity by design or security by design, drop the cyber, security by design right, what does that actually look like? What does the world look like in that sense?
That's a good question. I think that what you'd get would be, you're not going to get 100% security.
Yeah, never.
You'll never get that. Everyone agrees. But what you will get is a world without toys like My Friend Kayla, which was a toy produced by Genesis Toys, an American manufacturer, and marketed a few years ago. And this was a toy for children with a unsecured Bluetooth connection, which enabled then outsiders to eavesdrop on conversations, other activity in children's bedrooms, and possibly even to communicate with the children. So this was a toy that looked really, really fancy and was sort of Bluetooth connectivity enhanced, but where the basic security settings were simply not there. And indeed, in Germany, that toy ended up being taken off the market because it was seen as an espionage device under German computer crime legislation. But, that is exemplary of a whole range of products that are now being rolled out to make us all more connected and to increase our convenience, et cetera, But getting the security settings of those devices initially configured so that you do have reasonable settings for security in the first place, that will hopefully be something that happens if the security by design vision is properly realized. And that in turn will create hopefully a more consistent and reliable, robust information ecosystem that then feeds into and off critical infrastructures. But as I said, we'll never get perfect security, and possibly we don't want perfect security.
And this all goes back to the original tagline of this podcast was, how do we ensure that technology is making our lives better, not just easier? And I think that the concept of security by design and security by default, can you just for the listeners explain what the difference between security by design and security by default is? Because in the example you're just giving there of the child's toy, actually it's important also for it to be by default as well. So can you just expand on that?
So I see by default as sort of the little brother or the little sister of the by design mandate. Yeah. So it's basically saying you need to have a product with configurations that optimize the particular value, or like in this case security. Yeah. So that you as a user of the product, a consumer, you're not the one that has to make the product more secure. Yeah.
You don't have to turn it on. Yeah.
Exactly. It is secure from the start.
Yeah. 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 It's shipped to you in a secure way rather than you having to delve through all of the settings, assuming that the settings exist to find the thing that you need to turn on to make it secure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And where often consumers either they don't know or they're not particularly interested in doing anything about the security settings. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So we're talking here about, we've focused a lot of our discussion on security by design. The most common three legs of the stool, if you like, in Australia that we hear is privacy by design, security by design, and safety by design. We referred to some of the other by design mantras earlier. Do you think it's possible to talk about security by design in isolation? And is it still useful for us to talk about the individual mantras by design, or should we actually just be talking about more broadly responsible tech and designing technology that is responsible, with responsible encompassing all of these subsets?
Yeah, I think it is possible to see all of these individual by design mantras as part and parcel of a broader endeavor. And you're flagging sort of responsible design, I guess, as one possible term for that broader endeavor. There have been a number of other terms used up through the years. Value sensitive design. Yeah. That's, particularly Butcher Friedman's work. Values in design with Helen Nissenbaum's work. You've also got the notion of values for design. You've got legal design. So there are lots of design mantras that flag the need to embed human values in technology development. And then we've also got this notion of responsible innovation or responsible research and innovation, which is particularly strong in Europe. And they are all, I guess you can all see them as reflecting what you would maybe call responsible design or, they need to be sort of linked up, the commonalities acknowledged. The problem with a term like responsible design is that it is very broad.
Yeah,
and
we're
diluting
it. Yeah.
So to operationalize it, you are probably going to have to go back to these various components like security, data protection, safety, openness, et cetera, et cetera. There's also a lot of focus on so-called ethics by design as well in Europe, particularly in relation to smart robotics and other sort of AI applications. Again, I find ethics by design a bit too fluffy on its own to communicate clearly what is really at stake.
Yes, exactly. And I think the operationalization, gosh, that's a terrible word, of ethics by design or any of these things, like actually getting to a point where you can articulate within a legal framework an obligation for the people who are designing the technology, but also then for the regulators to be able to enforce it, to oversee it, and for consumers and the general public to be able to understand what those obligations are as well. It is hard, and I think the concept of responsible technology, at least in Australia, is gaining increasing momentum. But I do agree with you in terms of you don't want to water down these concepts, which in and of themselves are actually very immature as well. So we need to be bringing that depth to the work.
I think the notion of responsibility is good, and it links up with corporate social responsibility, for example. So there's a lot of responsibility discourse that has some established methodologies and parameters for its terrible word operationalization. But you were talking about sanctions before, and one of the challenges with sanctions for breach of very vaguely worded legislative provisions is that courts or other regulators will maybe be reluctant to wield a big stick if the norm they are trying to enforce is seen as a bit too fluffy, that it doesn't meet your standard rule of law ideals of consistency, certainty, foreseeability. And I certainly had that concern with Article 25 of the GDPR. When I was first looking at it, I was thinking, A, this is so hard to understand. Does it actually make sense? And B, I thought this is way too diffuse to ever attract the large fines that you can be whacked with under the GDPR. But surprise, surprise, if you look at some of the recent decisions coming from EU regulators, Article 25 is being enforced. And the latest example is from the Irish Data Protection Commissioner in a case involving Meta, where the Meta has been whacked with 405 million euros in fines. Now, you could say this is still pocket money for Meta, but nonetheless, it's a huge amount of money.
It's a big amount, yep.
And Article 25(1) on data protection by design and Article 25(2) on data protection by default, they are both part of the mix here. And so that's signalling to skeptics like myself that no, even though these provisions are quite vague, they nonetheless can be enforced through a fines regime.
And I think just to call out here to a piece that one of my colleagues at the Tech Policy Design Centre published in Innovation Oz earlier this week or the week before. I've been on leave, so I can't quite remember exactly when, but it was looking at some of the increased provisions and increased expectations of the Australian Privacy Commissioner, who is one of Australia's least resourced regulators. So I think there really is the importance. It is important that as we are creating these enforcement regimes, that we're also resourcing the regulators to be able to enforce them, rather than it's wonderful to have a law on paper, but unless we've got regulators who have the capacity to actually go out and monitor and enforce, they're not actually going to have that regulatory impact, which then goes back to the effectiveness argument. So we'll put a link to that. Yeah. We'll put a link to that article up.
Good.
So one last question and then one fluffy question, to use your terminology. I've seen in some of your writing that you warn that the legitimacy of security by design as a regulatory principle could be weakened if it's used to further authoritarian or corporate interests at the expense of civil liberties. Can you explain what your concerns around that are? I think I understand what they are, but it's always useful to hear it from the horse's mouth.
Okay, so security by design is tied to the concept of security. And security is one of those terms that has a large range of what we call referent objects. And those referent objects may often be politically or economically charged. Think about national security, for example. National security, national sovereignty, those are values that could get incorporated in a security by design regime, and where you invoke them to exercise, extraordinary exercise of power.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be at the expense of civil liberties.
Yeah.
And you can see the way in which security, cybersecurity, and security by design is getting tied up with those sort of national security discussions.
National interest,
around,
public interest. Yeah.
Yeah, but also, think about all the kerfuffle around who's going to be involved in rollout of 5G infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
So if security by design mandates start getting caught up in those sorts of discussions where national security is in the sort of front seat, it can end up being used in a way of to strengthen state interests, possibly at the expense of civil liberties, and possibly in a way that then pushes state interests in an authoritarian or semi-authoritarian way. And that would then create a sort of crisis of legitimacy for security by design.
And actually undermine the intent of cybersecurity by design, actually. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, to some extent. And then in the terms of the private sector, we have examples where companies have used security as an excuse to do things that are really motivated by the desire to keep a particular market for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So think of the examples to do with use of printer cartridges, for example, where you have printer manufacturers citing security fears as a reason for installing smart chips in their ink cartridges in order to ensure that only those cartridges can be accepted by their printers.
Huh. I hadn't heard of that. That's fascinating. Yeah.
So, and then Sony, about 10 years ago or so, with its PlayStation 3 consoles, took away a particular feature of those consoles in order to stop users of the consoles incorporating Linux as an operating system for the consoles. And Sony did so using security or cybersecurity as the pretext, but really, as a cynic would say, no, Sony was simply acting to maintain a particular market dominance here at the expense of Linux. So again, these are examples where commercially grounded proprietary concerns are really at play, not security concerns, and where security is simply being used to, in effect, whitewash those concerns.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important part of the conversation. It just demonstrates the complexity of something. When you hear the term security by design, you're like, yes, that's a good thing. Let's have lots of that. But it's also important to make sure that, we get the wording right, the clarity, the frameworks, that we're thinking about the way that things can be misused. And one of our previous guests on the pod, Justin Warren, who's the head of Electronic Frontiers Australia, has one of the things that he said, which comes back to me often, is, when we're crafting new legislative proposals, we do need to think about how will this be misused? How can this be misused? And have that front of mind. Hopefully I'm not putting words in Justin's mouth there. But I think that also helps to demonstrate why we need more people engaged in these issues, focused and providing this type of commentary and debate, which leads into one of our last questions, which is, what words of advice or encouragement would you have for people who are perhaps considering entering into a career in tech policy, law and tech, this type of field? What advice would you give to them, or what advice do you wish you had received when you were starting up?
Well, I think engage with design discourse. It's definitely part of the equation, and I do see it as increasingly being on the radar screen, regardless. It certainly wasn't on the radar screen when I entered into this area over 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But it's part and parcel of I think a general societal trend that, for example, Bruno Latour talked about when in his work. Design is becoming increasingly something that people are aware of, thinking about, and trying to sort of use in ways that will ultimately benefit society. And also thinking through the implications of bad design. But that said, I think we've also always got to remember that good design is really hard to get right.
Yeah.
And there is perhaps an underappreciation by legislators and other regulators that simply having a by design mandate in legislation or in policy documents, that's not a silver bullet. It is necessary, but there's a lot of hard work to be done afterwards. And there are lots and lots of things that can go wrong because information systems rarely develop in the way their designers envisaged. Yeah. And there's often a gap between what the designers think their system is doing and what the users ultimately think the system is doing and
how they use it.
Yeah.
You've given us lots of great recommendations and names and authors through the conversation. The last question we always ask everyone is, are there any particular books or resources that you found particularly helpful or that you would recommend? Have you got any nuggets of gold for us?
Well, there is a good book by a Dutch guy called Jaap Henk Heupman. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
It sounded like you were.
Yeah. He wrote a book published last year by MIT Press called Privacy is Hard and 7 Other Myths Achieving Privacy Through Careful Design.
Oh, I like it. Yeah.
And he's always very, very pragmatic. In a sense, very Dutch. And he's just trying to dumb down, but in a good way, privacy by design and data protection by design and also security by design, and show that we can take through fairly simple, straightforward, commonsensical measures a lot of steps that will make a difference. Another innovative piece of work, but it's a little bit older now, is by Sarah Spiekermann, who's Austrian and working from Vienna. And she wrote a book published back in 2016 by Taylor and Francis called Ethical IT Innovation, a Value-Based System Design Approach, which is sort of going more in the direction I think you were flagging around sort of responsible design. And she's also leveraging off the work of Batya Friedman and Helen Nissenbaum. And I find Sarah's research more generally fascinating. So she's the one who carried out a survey of computer scientists in which it was revealed that many of them didn't find security particularly interesting or pleasurable.
Yeah.
And then I guess I can always flag my own articles, but they are fairly legally focused.
Well, we'll put the two that refer to these particular topics that we've been discussing. We'll put links to those up in the pod notes as well.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. Really enjoyed the conversation and looking forward to lunch with you later in the week. So sorry, listeners, you don't get to hear that conversation. But thank you so much for making the time, and we'll talk to you soon.
Great. It was a pleasure, Johanna.
Thank you. Tech Mirror is a podcast of the Tech Policy Design Centre at the Australian National University. This episode was produced on Ngunnawal lands by Jack Fox. Ben Gowdie provided invaluable research and post-production support. If you would like to support the pod, please give us a 5-star rating, or even better, leave us a short review. This really helps us to get the word out. We also love it when you send us questions or comments. We read them all. You can find out more by following us on Tech Policy Design on Twitter or LinkedIn, or Google Tech Policy Design Centre and follow the links. Thanks for listening. Get in touch and get involved.